Well, I think Len Lai is one of the great masters of animation, and you're quite right, he's not as well known as he should be, but over a period from 1929 to 1979, he made a whole series of wonderful animation films, and in every film he did something new. So he's a great innovator, and I think it's wonderful that we're able to show his films here at the film festival, and he would be delighted because it's an animation film festival. He would be very impressed that there was a festival specializing in animation. I think the aspect of his filmmaking which has put him in history books is the fact that he was the first to develop making films without a camera, and it happened really because he was too short of money to hire a camera in the Depression during the 1930s, and so he began making films by painting directly on the celluloid, and he also developed a whole series of other methods of what he called direct films, working directly on the celluloid without cameras, and he was such a master at doing that. He had a fantastic eye. He could see movement in a way that I think nobody else had done up to that time. So the films are very special, and they continue to be great models of how one can make a film by painting or scratching or in some other way putting your images directly onto the celluloid. No, he actually started to make films without a camera in London. He managed to get funding from the GPO film unit, John Grierson's GPO film unit, which was famous in the 1930s for very original filmmaking. And his films had the effect of polarizing the audience. That is to say, half the audience loved them. They'd never seen anything like them. They were so brightly colored and so dynamic, so full of energy. And the other half of the audience hated them because they were abstract. They were like modern art, and many people in the 1930s didn't like modern art. So half the audience cheered and clapped, and the other half the audience booed. And so it made so much controversy, so much argument, that the newspapers began to run stories about it. And so during the 1930s, Len Lai was actually very well known in England. Well known for being controversial. Half the audience loved them, half the audience hated them. Yeah, many people were inspired. Just to give one example, the filmmaker Norman McLaren, who had been born in Scotland, but who later became famous working in Canada. And Norman McLaren, he had started to experiment with painting directly on celluloid, but when he saw Len Lai's films, he saw them because he was working at the GPO film unit also. When he saw Len Lai's films, he said, I'm going to do this. He said, now I can see how it can be done. And for the rest of his career, he and Len Lai were very good friends. I think the interesting thing nowadays is there's kind of like two bodies of work. At least this is the case in New Zealand. That on the one hand, there is very sophisticated, very complex computer digital animation, and New Zealand has developed a lot of work in this area. I don't know if you know the work of the films of Peter Jackson, like Lord of the Rings, or Avatar. The film Avatar, a Hollywood film, uses some of the digital animation made in New Zealand, 3D animation. So on the one hand, there is a lot of very complex, very expensive digital animation. But on the other hand, there is animation by hand. There is animation on a very small scale. And I guess that's the tradition which continues the work of Len Lai. It's kind of like still wanting to make small films, but films which are totally artist films, auteur films, films that have the hand or the signature of the artist making them. So we have these two, I've noticed that these two extremes are coexisting. The computer stuff connects up with computer games, and that will be huge, that will be hugely popular, and lots of development will go on in that area. And some of that work is really amazing, but I still myself love to see films, and I've seen some here at the festival, which are really very small. They're on a very small scale, and the hand of the artist is still drawing or painting the images. Len Lai's particular abstract sense was very much connected to the early years of modern art, what we call modernism. And last night we saw a wonderful program by Oscar Fischinger, who was a friend of Len Lai's. And both Fischinger and Lai made films which were connected very closely with abstract modern art. And that tradition, in a sense, is perhaps not quite so immediate today. Many of the films one sees today are less abstract. And I think the tradition, the wonderful tradition of East European animation is often is more concerned with figures and telling a story, whereas Len's work is purely abstract. And I think in a sense it goes back to the great days of abstract art and modernism. But that will always continue. There will always be wonderful work of that kind. The difference is that you can do that kind of thing on the computer. It's very easy on the computer to have a program which creates abstract images. For example, you can have music, which immediately becomes abstract images. But it's simply not as satisfying. The difference is enormous. If you see a Fischinger film, or a Len Lai film, or a film by Ruttmann or any of the other great abstract filmmakers of the past, the fact that they did it by hand, or they did it frame by frame, the fact that they worked at it so hard, every frame is conceived and calculated and drawn, meant that the films are so tight, they are so beautifully made, so beautifully shaped. And the danger today is it's so much easier to do it on a computer. It's easier to do it, but the results may not have that same, Len would say ziz. He made up a word, ziz, and the word meant a kind of tremendous energy, and that he was fascinated by the fact that animation could give you that energy, and it was an energy that made you feel like dancing. He was always referring to dance, that good animation is like a dance to music. If there's music on the soundtrack, he said, these images are my dance to the soundtrack. And that wonderful sense of dance and energy, which we saw last night in the Fischinger program, wonderful dance, almost like ballet or modern dance. We have to be very careful with the computer that it's not too easy, that it's not too slick.